So as you can see, I decided to split this video up. After a consultation with all you guys, it seemed like the most popular option. Still though, as you can see, this first part is pretty long, so I will keep it short and come back before the end and do some kind of summary gibberish talking stuff. So let's just take a look at all the parts that's going on this bike, check those weights, and let's start building. So as this is a crash replacement frame and fork, I already knew exactly how much I needed to cut off the fork steerer, so that was the first step in getting this build started. On a totally new frame, I would probably have done this final cut after I made sure I was at the right height. And you know how it goes. Measure twice, cut once. I've done a couple of videos on this topic as well, so check the link up in the corner or down in the description. Next, I decided to try and sort the internal Di2 routing through the handlebars. This is the first time I've used handlebars with internal routing, so I figured it would be easier to get as much done off the bike as possible. I also removed the clamps from the shift levers, so later on I could just mount the levers directly to the bars without trying to thread them on, with all the hoses and cabling hanging in the way. The left clamp from my new shift lever was really tight and actually left some marks, but shit happens. So the first Di2 cable I routed was from my right shifter down to the internal junction, down at the bottom bracket. This cable is 120 centimeters long, and I will take advantage of these plastic pipes that comes pre-installed in the bars once you get them from the factory. And I will use my homemade routing tool made of a steel wire and a brake ferrule. And thanks to these plastic pipes, it's a really simple job. Just thread the steel wire through the pipe, connect the Di2 cable to the brake housing ferrule, and then pull everything out through the handlebars. At this stage, with only one cable going through the handlebars, it wasn't too bad. I didn't have that much of a trouble. A bit of a snag here and there, but could get it through pretty easily. I did realize though that having a total of 2 Di2 cables plus that brake hose eventually was going to be pretty fiddly. I can definitely say that internal routed handlebars, they look really sweet, and I think it's worth it once it's done, but damn, it's annoying to work on. I'm definitely not looking forward to switching bars or hoses or something else that requires this to be disassembled. On the plus side though, with the hoses and cables more out of the way, it's much easier to strap on handlebar bags, lights, computer mounts and other stuff. So there's definitely merits apart from the looks. The next cable is going between the shift levers inside the handlebar, and here we don't have a plastic hose that goes through the clamping area. So instead I took my routing tool, and with the help of some Allen keys and a wheel magnet, I managed to get it through the whole handlebar without that plastic pipe. I did struggle a bit though, I can't deny that. It did snag at a couple of places, so I had to pull it back a bit and then push it through again, and use my small Allen keys to help catch that wire at a few different places. That wheel magnet also made it a lot easier. I guess a stronger magnet would be even better, but the wheel magnet was all I had at my disposal, but I got it through in the end, luckily. If you have any other tricks and tips to get this done easily without spending a lot of money on proper routing tools, be sure to let me know in the comments. With the tool finally through the handlebar, just like before, I connected the Di2 cable to the routing tool and then just worked it through the handlebars by pulling and pushing on that wire. The cable is 55 centimeters long on this handlebar that is 40 centimeter wide. If you have wider handlebar, you might have to increase the length of the Di2 cable as well. I think it will be too short on a 44 centimeter handlebar, for example. The third and last Di2 cable that's going into this handlebar is the one that's going from my left shifter down through the drop into my handlebar end junction. By far the trickiest cable to route in my opinion. So what I did, I used one of those plastic pipes that come with the handlebar, pushed it in through the drop and used a small Allen key to fish it out at the opening behind the shift lever. I tried to do it directly with the routing tool, but that didn't go well at all. So in the end, this was the only method that worked. Once the pipe was through, I thought it would be smooth sailing. Getting the routing tool through the pipe was no problem. I connected the Di2 cable to the routing tool and quickly realized that the connector length combined with the routing tool brake ferrule was too long to insert the correct way to the handlebar. So basically I had to push it down towards the back of the handlebar. There's not enough space to flip it inside the handlebar. So in the end I actually pulled the whole cable, flipped 180 degrees as you can see once I pull it out here through the bar end. But the important thing, I got it through and the cable is still intact, so yeah. Not totally pain-free, but I managed to get this sorted in the end. So that's all the Di2 cables through the handlebars. And to prepare for the hoses that I realized would be a real pain in the ass, I decided to route 2 steel wires from each shift lever or lever. It just hit me, do you say shift lever, not lever? Oh well. To have 2 steel wires from each lever or lever to help me route those brake hoses. As you will see, they didn't make that much of a difference in the end, but I thought it was a good idea at the time. So before I put the handlebars on the bike, I will use my old rear brake hose from the crash bike as my front brake hose here, just to save a bit of money. Always good if you can reuse some of the parts you already have. I cut the hose using my box cutter against a wooden piece of plank. I found that just using a box cutter is an easy way to get a nice and straight cut. Just tap that insert into the hose, and once that's done I will route the naked side of the hose through the handlebars, so I will end up with the insert at the shift lever or lever. Then I will cut the hose to length down at the fork, as I think it will be easier than to cut it at the shifter. As you can see, more than the actual steel wire, my small screwdriver was the main reason I got this hose through. But the steel wire was not totally useless, so I was still happy I had it there. The hose combined with the 2 Di2 wires already in place made it a really tight fit. So I definitely had to work it a bit back and forth to get it through, but once this is on the bike, I keep telling myself that it's worth it. Just to make it a bit easier to work with, I put the fork in the frame, installed the stem and also put on the handlebar. And this is just dry without any grease or anything, just to make it a bit easier to work with. Like I said, I will take it apart a bit later in the build and make sure everything is nice and greased up. Same with the handlebar and stem, I will just tighten this down just to make sure it stays in place while I'm working on those brake hoses. Then I whipped out my steel wire again. Have been very heavily used in this build. I used that wheel magnet again and tried to guide it through the fork, and once I got that through I could take my brake hose, thread it onto the steel wire and pretty easily get it through the fork down to the brake caliper. And if you've seen my old open up build videos, you might notice that this is the opposite way of how I did it in that video, and that's because of those internal routed handlebars. Then I moved on to preparing the rear brake hose, tapping in that insert, and just like the front brake hose, I will route this the opposite way to how I usually do it, as I want as much possible slack at the handlebar when I try to get this through, using those steel wires again that I prepared. But just like with the front hose, this is a really tight fit with those Di2 cables in place as well. As you can see, I just taped them down with some masking tape to make sure they don't slip away. In the end, I used that small screwdriver to fish it out through the opening at the clamp area. See, that was easy peasy. I'm joking though. It was a proper pain in the ass, but since the hoses now are through the handlebars, I would say that the most annoying part of this build is done. A long way from finished though. So because I'm routing from the handlebar down through the frame, I need to put on everything that goes on before that. In this case, I'm using some shrink tubing, and also need to put on the cable stops or the hose stops, as well as the foam that goes over the brake hose to keep it from rattling, that comes with the open up frame. This is just the right size to push it through the opening in the frame, so it's definitely simpler to do it when you route everything from the chainstay side. But since I'm using these handlebars, I think this was the better direction to route everything in the end. Once I got the hose down to the bottom bracket, I used, you guessed it, a steel wire to route the last part through the chainstay. I will say that if you have a spare spoke or something like that, like Open actually recommends, there will be a much easier and quicker way, because this steel wire is just too flexible to work with really. But managed to get it through in the end, so all good in the hood. You can always improve though. So then I just had to make sure everything was going into the frame as it's supposed to. Make sure that foam is all the way into the down tube. Then just a quick turn of the handlebars to make sure I have enough slack in the hose to turn the bars all the way around without it pulling on the hose. As I mounted the shift lever clamps when we started this build, it's now a lot easier to just mount the levers back on the bars. Since the cables are internally routed, you can't really move the lever around that much once they are connected to the hoses. So it all made even more sense once I got to this stage that I actually put the clamps on first. I didn't think about it then, but sometimes you're lucky. Anyway, I mounted the rear brake hose into the lever. You know the drill maybe. Hose nut, then the olive, and then into the lever body. And just as I was so proud of myself for having mounted that shift clamp early on, I realized now that having the shifter mounted to the bars before I actually tightened down the hose was not the best idea. So I made sure not to make the same mistake on the front brake and connected the hose while the shifter was still off the handlebars. That made it a lot easier to tighten it down, and since I have that clamp already on the bars, I just needed to connect that later on. So that was definitely a better order of doing things. Also, when you tighten down the hose itself can kind of twist. So when you mount it to the lever, you can try and make sure it's as straight or natural bend to the hose as possible. So with the hoses connected and the shifters on the bars, I put the levers in the ballpark or where I think I would like to have them in the end. Also made sure I had my stem at the highest point. I can always slam it down, but if I measure my hoses in the slam position, I might not be able to raise my handlebars that I like to do when I go out on a bit longer adventures and bikepacking trips. So now on to the fun part, that is getting the hoses cut to length. So I will just attach the brake caliper to the fork and then basically just estimate how much hose I need to get all the way down into the caliper. There will be some slack between the fork and the handlebar as well, so it's not super critical, but like always, measure twice and cut once. Luckily, I don't have my vise connected to a workbench, which is good, as I can move it closer to the fork to tap this insert in. I will say though, if I had the Shimano hose cutting tool and insert pusher, or whatever you call it, that would have made this part a lot easier. So I will put a link to this tool in the description if you're interested. I might have to buy one next time I do something along these lines. With the hose insert in place, it was just a matter of getting the hose down into the caliper. Hose nut first, then olive, and then into the caliper. And just like with the levers, having the caliper not attached to the fork made it a lot easier to tighten that hose nut down. Then just put everything back on the fork and the front is finally done. The rear caliper is basically the same story. I attached the caliper first and then tried to estimate how much hose I needed to cut off. I don't actually remember how much right now, but you can check how deep the hose goes into the caliper before you have everything routed, and just keep that measurement in mind and add a few millimeters just to be on the safe side. So I used my box cutter to cut this hose just as with the other hoses, and since this is a very ghetto solution, I used paper towels to protect my frame and managed to get the hose into the vise. That cutting tool I mentioned from Shimano would have been a very welcome addition to my tool collection for sure. The more I see this clip, the more I want to buy one. But I got it done in the end. Then the same story again, that hose nut, the olive, and then I could tighten the hose down into the caliper. And after that, put the caliper on the chainstay, and we are finally done with this hose mess. That sounded weird, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite done with the routing. I still had the Di2 cables to take care of. Luckily, compared to the handlebars, routing through the frame is not that hard. So I will just attach the cable clips to the Di2 cable coming from the handlebar. That is just to keep it from rattling inside the frame. Then I used my trusty Di2 routing tool, thread a wire through the opening in the head tube and push it down to the bottom bracket shell. And once set through, connect the Di2 cable to the routing tool and just push and pull it through the down tube. Luckily, no problem here. Once that Di2 wire was in place, I could tighten down that frame stop at the head tube with this little screw that is super easy to strip. I actually used a screw from my crashed bike first and I stripped that one. Luckily, I had other screws coming with the new frame, so saved by the crash, you could say. Then it was time to route the Di2 cable going from the junction to the seat post battery. I used the routing tool just as I've done at other areas. Attach the cable clips to the wire. In my case, this cable is 70 centimeters long. Depending on frame size and frame geometry, cable length could differ for sure, but I would rather have too long cable than too short. The last cable of this build is the Di2 cable from the rear mech to the frame junction. This cable is 60 centimeters long in my case, but if I had to buy a new cable today, I would probably buy a 5 centimeter longer one. The hole for the cable in the chainstay is too small to use the routing tool actually, so I had to try and get this cable through without the help of that. I had a lot of trouble with the cable snagging at the chainstay where it thinnens out to clear the tire, and it kept on getting snagged there. So in the end, I actually used a steel wire again and threaded it in through the chainstay and out the bottom bracket, and then kind of wrapped that wire around the Di2 cable, and I managed to get it through in the end that way. It was a lot more work than the first time I did this on my old frame, but I got it through in the end though, so lessons learned for next time. Now with all the cables in place, I wanted to make sure that everything was working correctly with the shifting and that all the wires were still intact. So I connected the rear mech and then attached all the wires to the internal junction that I will keep in the bottom bracket area. The cable coming from the handlebar I wrapped around the junction and secured it with a zip tie, as well as wrapping the junction in a small piece of handlebar tape just to keep that rattling noise from happening. Then I connected the other two cables to the junction. Since I'm running one connector will be empty, so I used one of those Di2 plugs that comes with the shift levers in place of a cable. Then I connected the cables into the shift lever as well, and having that Di2 connector tool really helps at this particular area. It's really hard to reach. The last cable in the handlebar is going into the handlebar end junction. since I'm only using one cable into the junction, I plug the other connector with one of those plugs again. The last part to connect this system is the seat post battery. And once you connect that, you will see those small little lights light up, and you should have a working system. And it's important to definitely check this before you start messing around with pressing in bottom brackets and stuff. You definitely don't want to discover that a cable has come loose in the junction or something inside the frame once that bottom bracket's already in place. So just to finish this first video up, I will just secure the battery into the seat post with this rubber battery holder. I think it's from Ritchie. We'll leave a link in the description as well. Just press this into the seat post and it will stay in there by friction. Put the seat post clamp onto the frame and then thread in the seat post. And I think this bike finally starts to look like something along the lines of a bike. So I think we'll end this video here. Is anyone still there? Sorry, that became a bit longer than I thought it would be. I couldn't really find a good place to end the video. I wanted to have all the routing related parts into one video. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep or got nauseous because of that first person perspective. There's probably two things I would do different if I had to do it again. One is to get some kind of spare spoke to help with the routing through the frame or the chainstay, to be more specific. And the other one is probably definitely getting that Shimano hose cutting tool. That would have made everything a lot easier as well. As this was my first internally routed handlebar, it wasn't too bad. I got it done in the end. I hope you all found it interesting or helpful in some way. If you did, you can always leave a like. It's much appreciated. And subscribe if you want to see the next part of this video. Well, you don't have to subscribe it. Then you will get notified when that part is up. So, catch you in the next one. Peace!